Welcome, everybody. We're excited to have you here, and we're really excited to have Joyce come and speak to us. I've been following some of Joyce's work just actually for not for very long, but really excited about the work that she does and her ecological approach to gardening. She is a master gardener with Meadow Thousand Island Master Gardeners Group, and she's based out of Kingston, Ontario. She lives in the suburban part of Kingston, and she's completely converted her front lawn to a beautiful forest, and she does it so masterfully. It's so quite inspiring. She was raised on a farm where her family grew and foraged and preserved enough produce to last the year. And now Joyce is exploring what it means to be in conversation with the edible forest garden on her lawn-free quarter-acre lot. She's a master gardener and permacultural designer, and she coaches people on foodscaping and wildscaping as a new approach to gardening in a changing climate. So she helped design and plant Kingston's first 2 public food forests, and she's now setting her sight on afforesting Kingston with Indigenous Little Forests. And that's such an exciting project. And my birds are so excited too. And so we will put a link for the Meadow Thousand Island Master Gardeners Club, the Little Forest project. It's really worth checking out. And she also has a blog post called rewildmycity.com, and that's also worth checking out. So without much ado, here we go. Joyce, we'd love to hear from you.
Designing with native plant communities. That's what I'm talking about today. And it's been a long learning experience for me to get to where I am today. And I think I'm just really at the start of my journey on learning. So about 4 years ago, I gave a talk at Canada Blooms, and I had this picture in my slide deck, and it was a slide deck on wabi-sabi gardening or imperfect gardening. And it was an example of curb appeal versus sole appeal, only to see in main stage someone from, is it Pro Lawn, with this picture up about the example of the perfect place that you want to have. So not me. And this is really around a lot of the world now. This is what the landscapes look like. And they're just cookie cutter. There's no differences, and no wonder all our native species are struggling. So we put lonely trees, and there's nothing for the little creatures there. Deserts, that's what our lawns are. They're food deserts for the bees, the butterflies. There's no food. And if you Google curb appeal, this is the sort of thing that comes up. But there's no food, no shelter, no places to raise a family. If a bird's flying by, there's no place. They don't stop. They keep looking. Monocultures, this is my two doors down. So this is my neighborhood. And still mostly looks like this, despite my lawn being completely different. They haven't been converted. So as Dorothy already said, we're in a biodiversity crisis. Our insects, our birds are crashing, as are many of our insects, including fireflies, bees, butterflies, spiders even. So this was my front yard when I moved in. A lot of asphalt. I think that was about half asphalt, semicircular driveway, 2 wings to it, grass, and some non-European white birch in the front. So really, really nothing for our native species. This is my poor husband, who I pick on, because he said he wanted a normal front yard. He said, go do what you want in the backyard, but do not touch the front yard. And as you can see out the window, this is a couple of winters ago, it's not normal. So we've redefined what normal is in our place. So the idea of lawns as being compulsory is a British idea, passed on like a raging infection, according to Noel Kingsbury, that this is part of what colonization has done to our area. We have raised and cut down most of our trees that used to live here and be on this land. They lack diversity. Our lawns lack diversity, and they're susceptible to pests and pathogens. There are species that do love monoculture, such as like June bugs and the invasive Japanese beetles. You find those grubs, and this is why there's that battle with the lawns. Skunks, they love that. So there are creatures that lawns support, and which is why we fight them with chemicals. So if you've ever seen this, this is the crows after the grubs that the raccoons and the skunks have been digging up. And it's a battle. So we battle what the land wants to do when we're trying to grow monocultures. And this is just not lawns, it's any monoculture really becomes a battle like this. So back to my husband here. Fortunately, he left town for a couple of weeks. And so I got the chance to start converting our front yard into something different. And with the help of some squirrels, especially, they were a big help in converting the yard. I started it, but they really brought in a lot of species that are now in my yard. And after 20 years or 20 years or more of negotiation, this is the new normal of my front yard, the forest that I have. And while I call it new, it's also old in that this is what the land would have looked like, or I mean, this is not a mature forest, but some of the species that would have been on this land before they were cut down and cities were built. So polycultures or plant communities, a plant community is a polyculture versus a monoculture. And they're Earth's technology, although technology seems like a weird word, but that's what makes things resilient. And one day I was walking with my sister, she was visiting, and we were walking down the street, and she made me turn around and come back to my yard. And then she made me turn around and walk down the street again. And remember that house I showed you with the monoculture one? To walk back and forth 3 times. And she was listening to the difference in the sound between the yards and how the sound really dropped off. So the sound of the insects. And this is what we should be hearing in our cities. Richard Powers in Overstory, he wanted to write a book about trees from the perspective of trees, but figured it wouldn't sell. But really it was about trees. And he wrote in Overstory, there are no individuals in a forest, no separable events. The birds and the bird and the branch it sits on are a joined thing. A third or more of the food a big tree makes may go to feed other organisms. Even different kind of trees form partnerships. And you know, an oak tree, as you know from Doug was telling me, saddleback caterpillar would be one of the species on the oak tree. And then there's braconnoid wasp cocoon. It's a community, a cycle with predators and with other species. So plant communities increase biodiversity, sink more carbon, and more resilient to changing climate. So that's like the more rational side of a plant community. For me, it's about solo kill though. But look at the difference between what we typically plant. And so if you look at a streetscape, if you look at a park, if you look at most lawns, this is more what you see. No biodiversity, the underground, if you look at the root structures, there's no differences there, no complexity. And then look at this one, all those different root structures, the different layers in the landscape, taller, understory, shrub, and flowering grassy things. So extreme diversity, many layers, and just a much more resilient ecosystem. These are a few images from my yard. I planted the goldenrod on the left, and like Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about with the asters and goldenrods, the New England aster came in all by itself, looking like, you know, that goldenrod looks lonely over there. I'm going to come and keep it company. Miss Joe Pine Weed is another one that just came in on its own in the oddest spot right near the back walk. And it doesn't get bigger than a couple of stems because of the spot it's in, but it comes back every year and the monarchs like it. They come and visit it. The butterfly weed in the ditch, and that has a mind of its own and seeds itself around where it feels like hanging out for a while, and it moves around, but it's never left. My front patio, I guess you'd call it a patio, and working on a bit of a shady meadow in that front right there. That used to be part of the driveway, and I left the path there. And you can't see the car, but looking out my front window, I really wanted to hide that car. And so I thought, okay, how do I do that? And I rerouted the path between the black walnuts that came in. And this is where it's like now, and we don't use our front yards because they don't feel welcoming because they're exposed. And we don't use them. They're not there for the insects. They're not there for the birds. It's all about the conventional idea of what curb appeal is. Ponds are big for wildlife. And I have a pond in the back that I dug early on. And so this is the back pond. And I thought about a front pond at one point, but I don't have one. We are digging a second back pond though. I don't have all native plants. You'll see some peonies and some alliums in here. And really, and I'm not going to talk about all the mistakes I made along the way, but one of them is you go to nurseries and before you start, at least for me, while I did look for some native plants, there aren't that many and things catch your eye. And so I had to learn over time, like stop just buying what's catching my eye in the nursery and start learning a little bit more about the plants and how they behave. My ditch, so I have a ditch and this is the coreopsis that has, I tried creeping thyme and the coreopsis was more happy, the one that became happy there and spread. A fringe tree, which is not native to Canada, it's a little more south. It is a Carolinian species, but it hasn't moved into Canada yet. I'm wondering with climate whether it will be. And this is 2 days ago in my backyard. And despite not being from this area, this fringe tree is one of my favorites in my landscape. What I haven't worked on and what in the last couple of years is I've learned a lot more about plant communities to pay attention to that bottom layer. I did use a lot of wood chips, the free arborist wood chips to cover the soil, but I focused more on perennials, not realizing that this ground layer and how densely you have to plant that ground layer and not knowing anything about sedges when I got going. And because I have a woodland garden, sedges are actually fabulous. And one of the really important things to just cover the ground and make it so that you don't have to worry. So the big shift, Thomas Rainier, and that's one of my books that I love, is Planting in a Post-Wild World. He says that the big shift he sees in horticulture is to stop thinking about plants as individual objects. And that's how they sell them in nurseries, individual objects, and think about them as social networks. That communities and compatible species interwoven. And so this row of red buds, we shouldn't be planting rows of red buds in grass like this. Thinking about them as community beings. See these red buds, they're in a layered forest community. That's more of a savanna, so it still has a bit of a meadowy aspect to it. Those are, I think, some low grasses versus sedges there. But thinking about communities at the landscape scale, but even at the very micro scale. So this is against a tree trunk. This isn't my yard. This is a forest walk that I do almost every day that's close by. And you'll see geranium in there, trillium in there, trout lily in there. And 3 very different species. The geranium will last all season in this teeny, tiny little space. Roy Diblick has a nursery and he's got a book called the KNOW, No Maintenance Garden. And he has a nursery, and this is what I believe our nursery should be doing. They are selling based on plant communities. You can see their signs there where they group the plants together that grow well and inhabit the same system. So these are displayed in community and you can buy them in community, understanding how they play together. And I love that he says not one plant is just a single note. And communities include, I mean, this is Cliffcrest Butterway, they include all kinds of creatures. And I don't know if anybody recognizes who this is. It's a firefly larvae. So fireflies in my yard, having a forest, I have lots of fireflies when the weather warms up a little bit more. And I don't know if you know, but favorite snacks include snails, slugs, and earthworms. So they're actually really great to have around in addition to being gorgeous, lighting up the night. They help keep the ecosystem in balance. So plant community approach also recognizes supports like stumps, logs, leaves, and old grass. So for fireflies to thrive, you need the stumps, logs, leaves, and old grass. These are the sorts of where they lay their eggs and where the larvae may hang out until the fireflies come for their brief spell as the beetles that fly around. Here's a stump. I collect stumps, and so stumps are my yard art. And this is a stump, I don't know, 3 years into it. And I was just walking by it one day in, I guess fall, it was the fall. And you see those were green sweat bees. And those green sweat bees were setting up for winter in those holes in the stump. And I hadn't really thought about that when I placed the stumps around, but sweat bee habitat. And we cut down our trees. There are trees that die, and I don't know how many people who've lost hope. Some of you thought to leave them as snags, so parts of them as snags, because a dead tree offers so much habitat and so much life for the rest of the community. And this is just an example, and you can't read it, but if you look on the left, that's a whole bunch of layers, and you'll see at each layer, they've got different birds in this case listed, because the birds are all living or sheltering or feeding on different layers. And so the more layers you have, the more diverse the species that you can support. And I'm just including this because these books are just coming out. It's a series called Kinship, edited by Gavin Van Horn. And I think this really touches on the difference between our conventional landscaping, and as we change the way we landscape, as we decolonize our landscape, this notion that we are living in an astounding world of relations. We share the ties that bind with our fellow humans, and we share these relations with non-human beings as well. From the bacterium swimming in your belly to the trees exhaling the breath you breathe, this community of life is our kin, and for many cultures around the world, being human is based upon this sense, this extended sense of kinship. And Robin Wall Kimmerer is one of the authors of one of these books. And as Singh says, meaningful sustainability requires multi-species resurgence, that is the remaking of livable landscapes through the actions of many organisms. And I mentioned earlier, the squirrels really help with planting my little forest, the little forest in my yard. And a species that I only really am starting to learn about are the different ants. And they plant 35% of wild seeds rely on ants to plant them. And since I now have a forest garden, I'm going to have to start recruiting the ants into the effort of really indigenizing the forest floor in my woodland. So now a little bit into the guts of how to do it, and designing with plant communities is adapted to eco sites of Ontario. So eco sites is how we should be thinking. And the nurseries talk about planting zones, but it's not about planting zones. Like you can see that zone 6A, 6B, it's in the Maritimes, it's down in our area, and then it's over in British Columbia. That's really not what we need to know when we're choosing and planting our plants. Instead, we need to know that we're in ecoregion either 6E or 7E, depending where you are, and that this is Lake Simcoe, and I'm in Lake Simcoe, ecoregion 6E, which is part of the mixed wood plains. And mixed wood plains was once 90% forest, and now only 17 to 20% forest is left. And this is, I don't know if this is why I'm in love with forests. I'm from the prairies, and maybe it's just because of prairies. There's just not much there. So forest has become my thing. Carolina in Canada has been doing a great job, and now they partnered with Loblaws to have this in the zone plant tag. And that's helpful because this is the type of zone we should be thinking about, that it's our local ecozone. The challenge is still, though, is knowing that this is from our ecozone isn't enough. So this little blue stem is planted in a bed of mulch in a little monoculture, and not with the plant community to live. And even is the soil right for it? I don't know. I mean, I have no idea with this picture, But these are some of the things that we should be also thinking about. And this is in the States. This is the Coast Guard, their headquarters. And I think it's really neat what they've done here. They've done some massive landscaping, but they've got that savanna within this courtyard and what I would call an alvar looking at that bottom right. And those are very specific plant communities, eco sites within an eco zone. And so you start thinking about your yard and what are the eco sites within your eco zone. There's a reference here, which I shared and will be shared in the chat, but 41 eco sites of Ontario. It's not really easy reading. It's still not easy from there to tell exactly what you should be doing or where you are. You'll see diagram, this type of elevation in the soil depth, and then they list the trees, shrubs, herbaceous layer, and non-vascular plants that might live within that eco site. We need a much friendlier version of what these are over time and to group our plants that way just to make it much easier for each of us to plant this way. But in Toronto, there's black oak savanna. And so back to here, the savanna there, this is an example of an eco site to learn from. And savanna, we think about our forests as being rewilding or left completely alone. And humans have been in North America, the indigenous peoples here have tended the forest for eons and eons. And so there was a lot of savanna and there's some savanna remnants trying to restore. And that was because they were tended by indigenous peoples. And the savanna is a plant community. It's a very specific plant community dominated by grasses with some scattered drought-resistant trees, and oaks being, in this case, the one type. The oak from Douglas Tallamy supports the most species of moths and caterpillars. And these are just some pictures of the black oak savanna at High Park. And you'll see, there's a lot of grasses with some mixed herbaceous plants in here. The wild lupins, and wild lupins need a very specific habitat. So we plant them in our nice garden soil and wonder why they may not thrive. Indian grass, so one of the grasses in the black oak savanna. They do have a plant list. So if you go into High Park black oak savanna and look it up, this plant, which would give you some ideas if you've got similar clay conditions where you could pick the black oak as a tree and look at these understory, the shrubs and the grasses and the herbaceous layer, and include them to make a plant community that does work well together. Alvar is another one, and I used to not know what an alvar was and think also that they were boring and ugly. But now in the forest I walk and there's a section that's an alvar. And alvars are actually a really important microclimate when you think about our city conditions, because alvars are, the limestone is really at the surface, either completely exposed or just underneath. And the columbine there, I always thought was a real forest plant, but the place I see it most is on the alvar. I don't know if anybody recognizes or can see what's on this juniper, the red cedar, but that is a specific butterfly larva. Juniper hair streak. And this is the juniper hair streak as an adult. Juniper, our native red cedar, is one of the top 10 trees for birds. And you usually can't buy it. It's so hard to find, and yet it's a great tree. And walking in the winter on the alvar, there's junipers there, and I passed a flock of robins that had descended on it, and I hadn't realized robins overwinter. So much learning to do. And they were stripping the juniper of the berries. And that's one of the reasons it's so important for birds, is for the late winter. And here's a design from Augustina Hain, where you'll see just the native red cedars in the back there in a more alvar-like planting that she's done. And if you remember the grubs I mentioned earlier on, this is the process from me, and it's a really, really big ditch, and it ends in an unfortunately walled in, concreted in creek. And right against that fence there, it's really scrubby, gravelly soil because of the fill. And you wouldn't think anything could grow there, but you see those two junipers right against the fence. Birds would have probably parked themselves on the fence and let a dropping or two go, and these red cedars grew. You can see that how lush the stitch is now. Most of which I dotted in a few things. I planted that white pine there, but now there's bur oaks, there's walnut, there's hickory, there's there's a whole bunch of stuff there. And so it's just, and that's something nobody ever complains about, bylaw complaints. No one's bylaw complained at that. In fact, one of my neighbors, it's a rental property and started to mow thinking they needed to care for the ditch. And the neighbors went over and said, please don't mow, because as the season goes on, it really is dominated by different flowers as well. And getting to know the alvar community, which is a really good one, again, because in cities, we often have poor or very rocky or by driveway soil, things like stout goldenrod. Carex, this is a type of sedge. And if we haven't discovered sedges yet, and you're tired of mowing grass, or you need something underneath your plants so that you don't have to mulch, sedges are awesome. And prairie smoke is not one that I've planted yet, but now I'm excited to, because it's a great alvar dry poor soil plant. Saxifrage, that's a picture from the alvar I walk on every day, and that's a wonderful spring blooming. Again, it grows in conditions you wouldn't think are good. This is off my front patio, and when you start working or ungardening and changing the way you garden with your land, species will come in on their own, and this is one that came in on its own, and I actually tried for 3 years to weed it out because I didn't bother to ID it. And then one year it started to bloom because I'd ignored it for a couple of years, and I finally ID'd it, and it's a wild plum, a Canada plum. And then walking on the alvar, on the edges of the alvar, this Canada plum was blooming. And so this is like the conversation with your land over time. Loosening control, seeing who comes in, adding some species yourself, and not worrying about perfection, of the old notion of perfection. We're learning along, and the plants are learning with us. And there's lists of alvar plants, and this is a list of alvar plants in the Great Plains. And so if you're trying to work on in your own space, if you feel that you have like dry conditions, very droughty, concrete all around you, alvars are great to do. And this is by EcoMan, the website I already referenced. This is, and it's would be partially native plants and partially non-native plants, but mimicking an alvar in the design. So in cities, we aren't in the conditions that it would have been before, unless we're in a lucky spot like a ravine. So matching your conditions with an eco site will really help you design a plant community that you will be more successful with. So clay bluffs is another good one for Toronto. They have lots of clay saturated soil in Toronto, just like we do here in Kingston, clay saturated soil. That's a witch hazel in the background. And is a slide, and I share the link in the references so that will be in the chat window. And you'll see that diagram with the different, the higher sedge meadow, upland forest, and then it drops down into a hanging prairie, keeps going lower. There's a bluff slope forest, goes even lower to a lowland forest. And there's different moisture levels here. There's different depths of soil. And so that's different plant communities. And so if you look at your conditions, does it match one of these eco sites? And then it gives you a great idea. These are a community set of species that would work really well together. So chinkapin oak, with the sassafras. Like just imagine that chinkapin oak with the sassafras underneath. If you got courage, the sumac, but sumac is a real spreader. So no recommend it. The oh, I'm blanking on that. Maple leaf by Vernon. This is it in the fall in the forest near where I walk. I don't have it in my yard yet, so that's a species I am adding in this year because I've got a lot of understory to still fill in. The serviceberry, and I don't know how many of you know how beautiful our native plants can be in the fall. Until I started walking regularly in the forest near me in the fall, I didn't realize so many of them actually have beautiful fall color, just like the trees do. And so this is largely after, which I have a couple of starting in my yard. And it's supposed to be quite an aggressive plant, but when you have a corner of an acre, I'm happy to have plants that are assertive and will spread and cover the ground. Bottlebrush grasses, again, because I'm a woodland shade gardener, what grasses might thrive in the shade, and this is one of them. And this is on the edge. This is oh, not platternut. Walking on the edge of a creek, again near the edge of a forest alvar. There's a different species you can have. So thinking now in your design, how do you make it attractive? So you've got a plant community, but how do you make it look good to the eye and low maintenance? In my yard, I actually haven't done anything this spring. I didn't even cut back anything this year because I've been so busy with little forests. And yet it's pretty resilient at this point because the layers have all filled in. And on the left is a traditional planting plan. So you plant in swaths. On the right is more the plant community approach, where you have your structural plants. Like you see those dots, those big circles and the tri-circles. Those could be shrubs, those could be trees, those could be tall prairie plants, depending on whether you have a meadow, a shrubland, or a forest. And then around them are all the kind of anchors that are attracted to them that give the color and the phenology across the seasons. And so again, planting in a post-wild world, you'll see the different layers. The bottom layer is the ground hugging plants. And then all the plants that we normally think of when we landscape, which give us the color through the seasons. And then not really thinking enough about the structural plants that help pull everything together. So those are the design layers as top two. And the bottom layer is that functional layer, which I mentioned earlier, I haven't paid much attention to until the last couple of years, is how do you have that layer that weaves everything together and completely covers the ground so that you're not worrying about mulch, you're not worrying about bare soil. Now this is often, when we aren't so pleased with it, this is an example of something that doesn't feel quite right. And why is that? And it's really because it's all one layer. There aren't different layers there. It's just a mass of the same plant or a few different plants, but they're all at the same height. So you don't have those different layers to capture your eye or to attract the different species that the different layers would. And so Nigel Dunnett, I think, has a good way of framing it is you think of those layers as eruptions. So there's plants that erupt from that base layer of grasses and sedges, and that give the seasonal color that attracts the different butterflies and moths and different creatures. And those could be, in this case, that's the butterfly weed. In this case, it's the serviceberries. So again, it depends what you're designing with. And sometimes when you have a very low level planting, you're not really having the same type of eruptions, but you're having instead the different, in this case, and this is my yard, and I planted these, which I think are a type of bluebell. I don't know, I planted them so many years ago and they bloom every year now. And they're with a hashira, a coral bell, and some sweet woodruff in this case. And I'm slowly adding more native plants into this mix, but you'll see the textural contrast in this case when you don't have the height difference in the layers. There is, this is a concept that's newer to me, and I think that is very helpful in thinking about choosing your plants, and it's how sociable are the plants that you have. And there's 5, the Richard Hansen and Frederick Stahl categorized them by 5 levels of sociability. They're individual or small groups, that's how they best plan. Small groups of 3 to 10, larger groups, advanced primary large areas. And those large areas are the ones that like to spread, or the little ones. And so thinking about that is helpful when you're wondering why some plants take so much work, or you're having trouble having things fill in. So just to give you an example, wild strawberry, ginger, our native ginger, our foam flower, our wild geranium, and the wood poppy. So the strawberry is a level 5, which means it likes to spread. So you put the strawberry in and it will run around everywhere and cover the ground. So fabulous for the lower level. The wild ginger is a smaller spreader, and so it's good to, again, to help cover the ground, but the foam flower really goes as well. And so in a woodland forest, something like that really helps. And it's assertive, so it spreads, but not overwhelmingly. The geranium gives some more structure, and the wood poppy kind of pops up over top and pops new plants around. And this is another one which you'll see the foam flower and how well it spreads. And I had bought my foam flowers years ago, and it was classified as a native plant. It was probably a cultivar, a nativar, because it never really spread. And I guess they sell some clumping varieties where really now I've ordered, and I'm picking up in next week, the spreading one that I hope will do something like this. And you'll see the ferns, they provide some of that structure in this picture. So every plant has a different strategy, and learning something about the strategy of the plants is what makes you successful. There's another, so maybe I'm starting to feel like maybe I'm going into too much complicated stuff here, but this is, how do they grow as well? How are they adaptable? They avoid stress, do they like to adapt? And so there's another, Kuhn categorized into plant types, and do they avoid stress? And so this also is useful when thinking about, so when thinking about your planting. And goldenrod, for example, it has a strategy of like, just, it takes over. So you know you don't want to plant Canada goldenrod because it's going to take over. Whereas if it's a gap occupation, like it likes to occupy gaps, then that's a self-seeder, something like that. And planting it like cardinal flower, you know that it's a gap filler, so you don't rely on it to stay, because it's probably, you know, it pops around and it fills up gaps. If you have no gaps, it will eventually disappear from your planting. So you don't rely on it over time. And that felt complicated, I know, because I tried it. But what's really, really good is there is a list, and I shared it, and you can see it in the chat, that brings those two concepts together into something, into 5 categories. So competitive clump formers, and you can look up native plants on this list and see, is it a competitive clump former? So does it form clumps? And is it competitive enough that that clump will stay there and resist when there's more spready plants around? And so bottlebrush grass would be one of them. The wild geranium would be one of them. The baneberry, the red baneberry is another clump former. And so these are those structural plants that will step up, stand up above those others. Aggressive colonizers, these are ones you might want to be more careful with, because they are going to spread. So if you want to time your planting, or if you don't want something to dominate, these might be ones you'd be more cautious about. And Nigel Bennett picked from this list, which is not something I agree with, because Virginia waterleaf, for example, I have a lot of Virginia waterleaf. I love it. I have a lot of forest floor, and this is great at covering the forest floor. The bees adore it. There's actually a waterleaf mining bee that specializes in this plant. You can eat the leaves. They're a little hairy, but they're edible. And you can see in this niche, in the micro niche, the soil here is of the sort that Virginia waterleaf is in this planting. Well, this is a wild planting, so this is a community that just formed all on its own. but it's got spring beauty, it's got trillium, it's got the, yeah, I'm blanking what the others are, but you can see like there's 5, 6, 7 different plants in that one plant community. So it depends on the niche that it's in. And then this is another one I tried, but as I was looking at the lists and looking them up, the rose vervain just feels like one that would play well and help cover my forest floor, as would this Pacora aura, which you can see here has spread a lot. Canada anemone, we plant grass because we feel that it's low maintenance and it will cover. Well, some of these spreaders, they will do exactly the same thing. And then you dot some of those pump formers above them, and then you'll get some contrast across the season and attract different pollinators. Moderate colonizers, so they're not as aggressive at spreading, but they still do spread. And this is one that I adore. It just covers the forest floor later in the season. It greens up right in the spring. So when it's one of those woodland ones that's there all year, many go dormant, and it blooms in September. So this is broadleaf goldenrod. The wood poppy is another one. This is the barren strawberry, and we plant in our garden. So many of those ground covers are commonly planted. Some of them very invasive, like goutweed. Some of them that offer no benefit. When we have, these could all be ground covers. And barren strawberry can stay green, and it's got the yellow flowers, fabulous with the sedges, and learning your sedges and planting them. And those mixed with these, and these, oh, lovely. Foam flower, you see foam flower peeping up. So these different strategies for survival, some are adapted to being underneath things like the columbine. So they all mix together and keep your floor covered. The accent plants, and these are just a color like the woodland phlox. And this one is just the forest that I walk in. I have tried it in my yard, but the rabbits adore it. And so I'm unsuccessful there. Bellwort, that I have a friend who has some, and you'll see Virginia waterleaf in the early spring right behind it there with that watermarked leaf. And then disturbance. And some of these we plant and then are surprised when they don't stay around. So these are the ones that often are best done by seed because they're very short-lived and they pop up in the gaps. And they're great because you always want things that fill in the gaps. And this is from Longwood Gardens, and they tried different mixtures and different seeds to see what would take. I've discovered that these cardinal flowers were the most successful in this kind of wetter planting in the forest edge. Jewelweed is one I have, and it hasn't really spread beyond my pond, but it's always very, very, very around my pond. Haven't tried it in my ditch, and I think I'm going to seed it there. But jewelweed is an annual, and it will keep popping up all over the place, and you'll see a whole bunch of jewelweed babies here. Another native plant that I checked, is it native to our region? And iNaturalist is a great place to see, is there any in your area? And then once you find out they are, then trying to find out where you can source them, and do you have the right microclimate for them? This is one of my favorites, and it pops up everywhere in my yard. Deep shade in the sun, it's a biannual. It's the Rutabaga triloba. This is actually not my yard in this picture. It's the edge of a forest. And designing with communities. And Roy Diblick, there are no rules. So there's these getting to know your plants, and then just trying things and learning as you go. Thinking about the wild feeding heart. Like your landscape, your land, it's a living, I think it's a living creature. It's full of soul, and who does it want to become? And that's why I see it as a conversation with your land. This is my son's ditch. He just bought a house last fall, and this was a picture in last fall. And I was there last week because he had a bylaw complaint because he's been converting it and he did no mow may. Well, after no mow May, checking it out. So this is where you start, is you learn and see who's there. And one way to learn and see who's there is to stop mowing. And blue-eyed grass, I'd never seen blue-eyed grass before, but sure enough, there was blue-eyed grass in his ditch along the edges of the ditch. There's Heath Speedwell was another one that we found, and this was a really nice patches. This one is a naturalized versus a native, but not aggressive. Hawkweed, which is another naturalized, and I'm not sure if this one will have to go. I'll have to learn a little bit more about how aggressive it is. Maybe a meadow buttercup, possibly early buttercup. So again, the meadow buttercup not native, early buttercup is. So do we try and switch it around? Limestone sedge is another one we found. So the grass and the part where the grass isn't so happy, the sedges have already really started coming in. And so that part of the ditch, we're really not going to do too much other than discourage maybe, well, the grasses, but encourage the ones that have already come in to spread. There's a carex, and this is not a picture of his ditch, but the one type of carex is a carex ovalis, and just look how fabulous those carex ovalis. And I just can imagine there's no more mowing then in the ditch, and sedges support a whole pile of species. And then this would be a couple like adding the carex niburna and the prairie smoke. That is the right environment for that alvar species. And the balsam ragwort is another one that we would add. And if you use iNaturalist, then I really, really recommend it, because again, you can search, you see the top right, you can look in Ontario, you can look in Toronto, and you can go click on the plant phenology to see the time of year it blooms and see if it's in your area. So it can help you plan those different seasons of bloom to maximize your support for pollinators. And this is a potentilla that's on the edge of my ditch, which is not on my son's ditch yet, so we'll move some of that over. And there's a lot of advice about getting down on paper and making your plans. I've never been able to do that. And I did a workshop, and the way they used, which I really, really liked, is you just take something like your old plant bucket, and you use those great big black ones as your anchors, your structural layer, and you play with them until they feel right to you. And then you do that, and you take different colors, or you can use flags, and you mix that around for those seasonal plants. And then the base, which is not marked, is that ground hugging layer that weaves in between everything to pull it all together and to make the maintenance as low as possible. And so this is what it looks like if you were to try and do it on paper, which is why for me it just doesn't feel so easy as doing it in part, like right on the land. I just like to work on the land. And this was a Thomas Rainier suggestion about if you do have a shady, dry, shady spot, the Carex Pennsylvania or the Rose Hedge, then coral bells is a contrast with woodland strawberry, spreading it in between. And if you haven't tried something like woodland strawberry, it's a great spreader. 50% ground hugging. So 50% plants like that, or the Carexes, to weave in between. And I think that's partly sometimes why we have so much maintenance, is because we don't nearly have enough of these types of plants in our landscapes. And you see all those little dots on the back to this diagram, the slashes on this side, and all these dots over here, and all these are different of those ground hugging layers. And on this traditional planting design, you don't have any of that. And that is, again, as I said, one of the reasons for the maintenance. And right, Rainier says, get down, be like a rabbit and look really, really low. And if you see gaps, then you don't have enough in that layer. And layering across time, as well as the structure, and that's the phenology, and that's just making sure you're supporting you have the flowering throughout the season, both for yourself and for all the different pollinators that you're trying to support. And Nigel done it. He likes to do it with 3. He says for your eye to look more designed, if you want to, if you want your neighbors to think that looks really nice versus they don't see a pattern in it, having 3 blooming at a time is really a simpler, and it's simpler for the eye, and it makes it look more designed. So Nigel John, really suggests 3 early spring, 3 late spring, 3 midsummer, and 3 fall. And these are just some pictures that show that, including in a woodland one. This picture only has 2, but you can easily add something like wild phlox or the spring beauty to make it into 3, or you just leave it with a subtle 2. And so you see the waves of color across the 3 seasons, and these not very complicated. And the grasses or the sedges, depending on the height of your planting, really help pull it all together. This is a schoolyard project. I'm not sure where, somewhere in the States, but you'll see again across the seasons how it looks. And Flower Patch for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. If you haven't seen that publication yet, that is a great one. And they do divide between spring, summer, and fall blooming. And you'll see that large leaf aster, the one with the beautiful fall color, is on this list, as is the one goldenrod that I mentioned. What is missing though, and here's one of my non-natives. So this one is 100% native set of suggestions. This is an allium I have in my yard. I have no idea where I got it from or what it's called, but you'll see those little green sweat beads on it. And this is late October that it's blooming. So I will continue to include some non-natives. I'm just trying to really up the percent that are natives in my plantings. But again, what's missing from this list is the grasses and the sedges. Butterflies also depend on grasses and sedges, and for some reason we don't talk about that enough. So little blue stem is a larval host for skipper butterflies. And you'll see they can leave their chrysalises hanging, this is from a little blue stem. Native clump grasses like little blue stem underneath, at the base of the plant. Bumblebees will sometimes build their nests. They're overwintering. Here's another planting, and you'll see again how the grasses, this is prairie drop seed, brings it all together. And winter. And so the structural plants are one of the things that really, and the grasses are one of the things that really carry that through, so it looks good even in the winter. And this is, again, back to my yard, walnut, edible, and pollinator community. So that's, I don't know exactly what my yard is, but I call it an edible forest because I've got 9 black walnuts now. I can't really have traditional fruit trees because they don't go with the black walnuts, but that one on the right there is a pawpaw, which is getting 7 years old now and doing beautifully. And you've heard black walnuts kill everything. Not true. You'll see this Luna moth. It's a host plant for Luna moth. And underneath, pawpaws grow really well with a black walnut, and it's the only host for zebra swallowtail. Such a gorgeous butterfly. I don't know if one day I will see one with the pawpaws I have. This is a giant swallowtail larvae, and their preferred host is the hop tree. And every year my hop tree has giant swallowtails on it. So that's a rare because it's just so specific in the plants it likes. And again, we don't talk enough about the host plants and our shrubs and trees when we talk about our pollinators. Spice bush swallowtail, I've got like nine spice bush. They again go really well with the black walnuts. And in spring, it's also an edible. You can make tea out of it. You can eat the leaves and the sedges. And so these sedges, there is a list again that I shared. I think it's from Halton that has host plants for different pollinators. And you'll see this list of skippers and the sedges and the grasses that they use. And one day, I hope to see a site like this of all these different swallowtails puddling. And so that's my current palette for my black walnut grove. And that's a picture in the left there of my black walnut, part of my black walnut patch. So transitioning a row of red buds, how might you do that? Tectonic safari, and that was a planting plan for somewhere in the States, I don't know where. But you'll just see, like, if you have the red one, you would plant a tree that, in this case, they show a persimmon, but whatever tree might work, and then need 3 different layers. But you'll see the conditional criteria: hot, part sun, wet, depressed. And so what is the plant community that will go in those conditions? And then you add the upper story and the under layers that go with that. Same with this lonely, probably an oak, can't see from the picture. But again, then what will go underneath? A flowering dogwood potentially, the alvars, the bayberry. And what's missing from these is the grasses again. But you've seen the ecological criteria. I think that one has it too. Shepherd Parkway, that's a very, very specific. You know, this one has acidic oak hickory forest, so that might be more relevant. So these ones aren't totally matched to our region, but they do give you an idea about how you might go about thinking about converting a tree or a shrub into a multi-level planting. So the future of cities, this, can you imagine? This was done for the city of Vancouver. And I don't know if they're quite ready to go that direction. I would love to see this in Kingston. So this is going to be, you know, I'm working on the little forests, but I don't just want forests, these pocket wetlands, the urban streams, just, can you imagine? And this is the type of, I think the type of tool we kind of need, which shows on the bottom, like the different eco sites, and then the different plantings that would go with it, and then all the different species, the insects, the bees, the butterflies, the birds that it would support. We're a ways away from that, but in the meantime, here in Kingston, one of the things that we are working on in the little forests, and we have the start of a list. This isn't for the full little forest, which has 50 some species in it. This is just a potential list to choose from if you're doing a back or front yard forest and you want to pick, you know, the canopy, understory, shrub, herbaceous, grass, and sedge layer that might work together. And this is Sheffield, England, where Nigel Bennett, his university, is based, and he's experimenting in his city. I wish our universities did that, but it will be up to us as community gardeners and activists, I think, to make this happen. And I'll just end with a quote from my husband. I'd asked him a few years ago to say what he thought of the yard. And this is what he had to say. The thing I appreciate about the yard is that in every season, there's some pattern to see, some structure that breaks the monotony of grass and flat fields of snow and ribbons of asphalt. The birds, the rabbits, the rare sighting of a fox, they all add to that viewscape. But the foundation is the variety of plants and their varied structure. I hope never to live in the center of a mowed down landscape again. Bringing the wild back into the urban spaces is empowering, attainable, and I hope will soon be common. So my winter wonderland will stretch as far as I can see. So now it's questions, and I'm not sure how long I took. I'm sorry if it was too long, but I will stay as long as you want for questions.
Thank you so much, Joyce. This was so interesting. And we do have a lot of questions. So one was around a lot of interest around the fireflies. Can you please explain us how to attract or how to produce fireflies in our gardens?
I actually accidentally did it myself, you know, and one of the reasons I love thinking about the fireflies is I come from Alberta and there are no fireflies. And my husband is very protective of our yard, despite not wanting it. And one day he'd been really cranky because he heard some people out in the back and he thought somebody was bringing their kid to pee because we have a soccer field behind the park. And it turns out a dad was holding up the little girl watching the fireflies. And you have to leave your leaves. They need places to overwinter. They need moist, damp. Leaving your leaves is really important for them. Keeping your lights off, so not leaving your lights on at night is another thing. Having pieces like wood or logs, that's another moist environment that is beneficial for them. And the layers in your landscape. So there's a Japanese micro seasons. Japan has, I think it's 52 micro seasons. And one of them is rotten grass brings fireflies, something like that. So allowing the decay to happen is really, so it's more of a hands-off approach than anything, not tidying up, leaving the leaves in fall, and allowing dark so that they can produce. You don't have to plant so much specific plants, it's more you have the structure and you leave things for them.
Thank you. I had another question about the role of pollinators for food production.
For people, food production?
Yes.
Oh, they're so important. And they've done studies around, there was actually, and somebody in the chat said this should be done for butterfly way. I was at a presentation 2 weeks ago called Rewilding the Veggie Garden. And what it was about is there is a woman who's on the Native Plant Society, and she just went through all the beneficial insects that you want to attract to your garden. The most important ones for protecting your vegetable garden, either protecting or pollinating, and what are the top native plants to attract them. So instead of our fixation on marigolds or alyssum or things like that, these native plants, and they have done studies in hedgerows, and hedgerows around a farm hugely increase the productivity of the crop. And so in the orchard that we've planted at Lakeside, and it's more of a polyculture food forest, is we're planting a lot of native plants, and we're doing a hedgerow around the whole garden, and that's where one of our tiny forests that we're planting in Kingston is going. And that's to attract both the pollinators and the beneficial insects that are the predators, like that wasp that we saw early on that laid the eggs. And even our fruit trees, we know that the best pollinators for fruit trees are our native bees. So the blue orchard mason bee, for example, much more effective at pollinating our fruit trees than the honeybees that get carted around right now to pollinate our orchards. So how do we attract those things and make habitat that they like?
So now the next question is, how, when I have a grass in my front yard, how can I best convert it to a functioning ecosystem?
Well, there's different methods. So my son's ditch, for example, the one half of the ditch, the south side, because it's very dry there, the grass isn't very healthy. So I don't think we're doing too much to that section. We're monitoring it and dividing, say, the blue-eyed grass that is there already, and we'll keep dividing it and adding and plugging in more plants. The west side, though, unfortunately, gets there's gray water that goes in there, so it's a thriving dense amount of grass, and so we are covering it with either cardboard, or I've got a bunch of old leaf bags, and then arborist wood chips. Arborist wood chips are phenomenal for improving the soil and for mulching, and weeds have trouble germinating within them, and you leave that for a few months and then you can plant. Another strategy, and again, we did this in my son's yard, is in the fall, we did a lot of cardboard, and we didn't have wood chips at the time, so we put some compost. And this isn't converted into a native, that one's not native. That's where all his vegetables went this spring. And it actually, we were able to plant right in it. And we're also dotting some different native plants in between the vegetables. So it's going to be like, it's a very mixed garden right now. So yeah, smothering it with newspaper, cardboard, if you've got time. If you want to go fast, if you're eager to do it now, rent a sod cutter. That doesn't take very long, and it's actually not too hard to use. We just did a garden at the school, and a sod cutter grass at the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Project too. So the sod cutter went to both places in the same day. Cut off that top layer of sod, which is actually really good. And if you're doing a native, more meadow garden, a lot of the plants like the poor soil. In rich soil, they'll flop, they won't look as good. And so you're downgrading the soil when you take that sod off and you plant right into what's left. And you will end up with a healthier meadow. And then you can use that sod to build up a different area where you want richer soil, maybe a woodland or a vegetable garden. So that would be a quick way to do it.
Thank you. So another question was that if we haven't done the work all that great, grass will show up in between our native plants. What should we do? Should we just leave it, or do we have to get at it?
Quack grass is terrible, terrible stuff. So if it's quack grass, I'd work at getting rid of the quack grass. The lawn grass, I don't like that either. You know, that's actually the only thing I really weed out of my garden these days. And while I watch for the aggressive, you know, we've got some non-native bugs or bindweed. I watch for things like that. The dog strangling vine. But the quack grass, you have to get rid of that. You'll be constantly battling, and it's too aggressive. The lawn grass, as if you've got like a third of enough native plants, those can over time like outcompete that lawn grass or shade it out. But I'd say, I don't know, depending how bad it is, I'd be inclined to lift out the plants and really deal with the grass and then come back.
Thank you. You mentioned a bottom layer plant, and I think you were talking about sedges at the beginning. Can you
Yes.
elevate on this a little bit?
Okay, so sedges look like grass, and some people confuse them in grass. And when you're mowing, especially if you have any wet areas in your yard, I suspect you already might have some sedges. In my yard, I didn't know anything about sedges, and all of a sudden this grassy-like plant that was more of a clump former. So a lot of our lawn grasses, they spread by rhizomes. Some sedges are rhizome, but a lot of them are clump forming. And so they have these lovely arching, just lovely arching shapes. And they bloom, a lot of them bloom this time of year. And some people say the blooms aren't very interesting. I actually really like the flowers. And there are at least 40 different types of Ontario, 10 that are getting more common. Last year I couldn't find to buy sedges. Now Natural Themes Nursery, which is in Belleville, we don't have a nursery here in Kingston. Now they have a number of different sedges, and there's two. I have some that came into the yard all on their own because I wasn't weeding, and some of these plants will come in on their own, and so I've been spreading those around. Some of the ones that haven't come in, I will be getting from Natural Themes Nursery. So if you check a native plant nursery, now they are starting to carry those sedges. And then you just look at Hoffman Nurseries in the States. They have a really good sedge comparison chart. So look, sedge comparison chart, Hoffman Nurseries, and you should find it, and they'll talk about the different form and whether they're sun or shade. So there's a sedge that I just love called Pollinator Foxtail Sedge, and it's blooming right now. And it's a taller sedge, so it's a very nice structural sedge. And my son's ditch, I've just got that in my mind. My son's ditch is going to be awesome in my son's ditch. And there's seeding everywhere in this area now. So all I have to do is collect the seed and I can toss it in there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have a question if there is the Little Forest workshops available besides in Kingston. If somebody is in Kitchener Waterloo.
I am giving a presentation to Prince Edward County that's virtual. It's at the end of this month. The link is on the Reno Thousand Islands Master Gardeners website on the events page. So if you check that out, you can, I think there's a registration link to that. And hopefully we'll be recording that can be available. And at the bottom of the Reno at the bottom of the Thousand Islands, it's just too long of a name. At the bottom of the website is a link to sign up. Like there's a form to get involved with Little Forest. Actually, no, I will just send you, I'll paste in the chat. There is a link to a form, and it's to sign up to get involved with Little Forest, but you can just sign up to just have the newsletter. So if you want to also see what's going on, we have a bi-weekly newsletter, and then if anything gets offered, it would be mentioned in there as well. So that might be the best way to stay in touch. But definitely the webinar at the end of the month is the first thing planned.
Excellent. And Joyce, we will be sending out all your resources per email to all the attendees. No, so then everybody can, because you have done an amazing job with finding all those really interesting resources. So I think this would be wonderful if we can share them. I have another question. If you have quite a small front yard and you want to convert it, rewild it, what would you do?
Quite a small. So does that mean no space for a tree?
So it's
I was still
5 by 4 meters.
Sorry,
5 by 4 meters.
5 by 4. I'm trying to think how big that is.
So this
So,
is 12 by 15 feet, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, it kind of depends to what feels good to you. So you could do like a mini meadow. You could still do a multi-layer with something. I'd probably go something smaller, like a serviceberry or a red bud, or oh, my mind isn't working at the moment. But if you go to the Little Forest, the Front Yard Little Forest spreadsheet that I shared, and instead of the canopy layer, you start at the next layer down, I would pick something from that layer, and then maybe a couple of things from the shrubby layer, and then the ground layers. And for the herbaceous and the center grasses, 1 plant per square foot, you're planting them pretty densely. And so you can actually plant a lot of plants in that little space and then depending on the visual appeal you want to have, if you want to maximize biodiversity, then you pick a lot of different plants. If you want to maximize like the aesthetic appeal for our human eye versus like the wild eye, then you would limit your palette to more like nine or so different species. Oh, much more than we normally do.
So I have another question. Somebody has a 60% plus north facing slope. What do you grow there?
Okay, north facing slope. So a lot of so that's and I'm thinking back to that, both the clay bluff. I'm thinking back to either that clay bluff slide, which I shared the link for, or even in the Little Forest spreadsheet. Now I'm going to just jump there. But those understory, I'm trying to think, like pawpaw, for example, is one of those understory trees that actually likes shade. You're not going to get as much fruit as it gets older, it wants more sun, but you can still have, like on the north side of my house, I have oaks, I have serviceberry, I think there's a dogwood over there. So you can have those different layers. And then the lower layer, you're really going for those woodland shade plants. But things like the spring sun, your trilliums won't do as well there. But there are plants like there's a honeysuckle that likes that's happy in deep shade. And there's leatherwood. Leatherwood is another shrub that is quite happy in deep shade. The sedges that I mentioned, there's quite a few of them, and they're very, very happy in deep shade. And looking at the herbaceous, the large leaf aster, the wild geranium, the blue stem goldenrod or the zigzag goldenrod, there is a lot that you can do. The ferns, There's a lot. So even have that shade pollinator garden, even with a north facing slope.
That's excellent. So I have a very different question. So there is sometimes maybe reluctance in some people to attract insects close to the house. What do you say about that? Because they're scared that they could maybe come into the house.
Most insects don't want to be in your house. So I wouldn't, I mean, I'm not aware of insects. The only insects that we've had a problem with have been the carpenter ants. And that has nothing to do with any woody plants around us. That's purely because we had a leak that rotted the wood. And the carpenter ants told us that we had a leak that rotted the wood. And as soon as we fixed that, the carpenter ants were gone, and they're not really any insects in the house. Just might indicate that you have a different problem. So, and then the bees, the native bees, they don't want to sting you. The bees that we think about, that we worry about, those are the honey bees that are much more likely to sting you, or the non-native wasp that irritates you when you're trying to eat. Those aren't the native bees that we're attracting with these types of plantings that we're doing.
So now maybe two last questions. How do we go, and you address that a little bit, about changing the common, feeling that people think wild places are not appropriate for cities? Like, how can we make people appreciate the new aesthetics more?
We were just talking about that. We had a little forum earlier today, and there was a young person. One of the people involved is she's in grade 12, and she's just a fabulous young activist. And she was talking about sharing with us how to have young people engaged and have them leading this sort of things. And and then she had us do little breakouts about how do you get people, what's your elevator pitch, what's your pitch to people around it. And one of the things she shared about getting young activists involved, which when we did our breakouts, was one of the things that came up is sharing stories of the beings that come to your yard once you welcome them in. And there's if anybody's on Twitter, there is a one of the people I follow is Jeff Vander Wall, who is a fantasy author of all things. But when Trump got elected, he got depressed, so he started rewilding his yard as a way to stay sane. And now he has like wildlife cams, and his Twitter feed is almost entirely who came to visit last night, and he's named some of the creatures. He's got a little family of armadillos just moved in. And so that had the local newspaper out because he was tweeting about it and showing the pictures of these little baby armadillos. So sharing stories like this, and instead of making it scary, like, look at the fireflies that all came out last night, and sharing that with people. I think that's one of the ways. Here, something that's really resonating with the little forests. We're working with the Indigenous community with the little forest. Maureen is one of the driving forces with it, and so the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden. And there's a lot of talk about reconciliation right now, and young people in particular, they seem to be, this is an issue that is really wrenching and, reaching their hearts. And so Maureen has used the phrase like, it's an embodied land acknowledgement. And we are decolonizing the land by doing this. And so depending on your audience, like some audiences, that's not going to fly. But other people, that's something that really resonates as an action that we can do right now. And another story, and something that Namira shared, and she was the young activist talking, was that for her, it just made her feel like the work that we're doing is just feeling like she's doing something that we can make a difference by doing something with our yard, doing that, or getting involved in a community project where you're doing that. you're setting an example. You're doing something that makes you feel so much better that you're making a change happen. And that is spreading. And other people are seeing that, and you're communicating that through story. And so maybe it spreads. And as that happens, you know, how quickly does change happen?
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of hope. We're feeling a lot of hope here.
So I have one last question, and I think it's a quite interesting one. How can you prevent soil spillage after a rain when you have your plants ejected to the sidewalk? Like, because usually grass would keep it, right? If you take the grass out, how would you still keep the soil from not eroding?
So I would, like, when you do your planting, I would plant quite densely. And if you're planting that, and remember the recommendation is like 50% is that ground hugging layer. And it could be sedges, it could be grasses, it could be things like the wild strawberry, it could be the barren strawberry. There's a lot of those different plants, and you plant them fairly close together. And so that gets roots in the ground quickly. And then if you do have that, then mulch also will help with that erosion. But you want to get the roots as quickly as possible established to help prevent that erosion. I think there is something that you can, and I don't know what it's called because I've never personally used it. And, you know, so I was wondering about it for my son's ditch, because that would be a place that you can have erosion happen. But there's something, and it might be a natural product that you can put down to also help with that. But I think a dense planting with some mulch should mostly keep it. And then timing your planting when there's not heavy rains coming, so that it has time to establish before the heavy rains start again.
Excellent. Joyce, thank you so much for being our guest tonight. It was really eye-opening. I think it is really worth for everybody to check out your, you say it again, the website.
And the Rita Thousand Islands Master Gardeners. And just to let everybody know, we actually have a weekly Ask a Master Gardener every Thursday at 1. And every fourth Thursday is a wildscaping related topic, and I often do those ones. And so if you subscribe to the newsletter, like if you just sign up, then you'll get the newsletter saying what the topics are coming up. And then I usually include like just a short, like today it was on the blue-eyed grass. So I usually include a short snippet about, and it's usually a native plant that's caught my eye that week, whether it be in the forest, at the community garden, or in my yard. So, and that's more of a personal, just something I noticed and something I learned. 2 weeks ago, it was about beetles and how cool beetles are, which I didn't know before either. So, you know, I think this is it, like telling stories about, you know, I didn't know how cool beetles were until I went to that native, you know, the Rewilding Your Veggie Garden talk. And then now all of a sudden I'm noticing beetles. You don't see things until someone starts saying, hey, and then you start noticing them, and then it's just fun.
All right, thank you, thank you. So thank you everybody for attending. I think we learned a lot. We had a lot of fun. It was very interesting for all of us. And we are looking forward maybe to seeing you and becoming a seedling sitter. All right, give me an email if you like to do this. I have lots and lots to give out, and I will be very happy if they get into the ground somewhere. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joyce.